Hey y'all, we have day 4 on our content packet here, and today we're going to focus on how we can apply what we've been learning about to the ancient civilizations. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you where we're going to be in our notebook packet, and then we're going to use these charts here to find out how each civilization used human, natural, and capital resources. Okay, so here we are on page 11, and page 11 says, where can we find examples of what we've learned about when it comes to the ancient civilizations we've learned about? So we're going to talk about China, Egypt, Rome, Mali, and Greece. And when we do that, we are going to be jotting down anything you hear examples of human, natural, and capital resources. Then, if you want to, you can jot down before I show you some possible answers, or if you want to just wait and pick your favorites, then you can jot those down right in here. So we're going to start with China, and here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to read to you a little bit about China to refresh your memory, and then we're going to talk about some of the examples of the resources. So China, the Chinese depended on many things. Their major crop was rice. They also had the Yangtze River where they fished and used to trade. They mined copper and tin in the mountains and used them to make bronze. So maybe you heard some examples of human, natural, and capital resources. But I'm going to show you a little chart that might help you determine which is which. So they had farmers, fishermen, and miners. And think about what each of these jobs would need. The farmers would need soil, sun, and water to grow their crops. Those crops would be rice, and they would need farming tools. So those would be the capital resources. Remember, human resources are the people doing the job. The natural resources are things they use that come from nature. And capital resources are tools they use or the goods that they make. So going on to the next example, we have fishermen. They would need the river and they would need the fish. The capital resources are also fish. Remember I said how capital resources can also be natural. Because if it's the thing that they are making or selling, then it becomes a capital resources as well as a natural resource. So don't let that confuse you. Also, they'd need fishing gear in their boats. And you can see a miner would be taking copper and tin out of nature, and they'd be using those to make bronze, which is a capital resource, the thing that they're selling or trading, and they would be using tools to mine. So you can jot down one example of each in your China box right here. And we're going to do the same for Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Mali. So you can pause whenever you want to if you want to jot some things down, an example of human, natural, and capital resource. But what I'd like you to do is keep it all the same. So if you were going to write down farmer, make sure you write down the natural resource and capital resource that a farmer would use. Does that make sense? I hope so. Let's move on to Egypt. And remember, you can pause whenever you need to. So Egypt, the Egyptians relied heavily on the Nile River. They used it to fish, trade, and travel. They used the fertile soil along the river to farm. They used the papyrus plant to make paper. They also mined gold in the desert to make beautiful decorations and trade. So you could probably pick out some of the jobs that the Egyptians were just by reading this paragraph. But I'm going to show you the chart that I made. You can pause this, look it over, and pick one that you'd like to add to your chart in the resource packet. I'm going to move on to the next civilization. You can pause it if you're still writing. Greece. As we know, Greece was located in the Mediterranean Sea. They relied on it to fish, trade, and travel. They used the many trees to build huge ships. The farmers grew crops that didn't need great soil or much rain, like olives and grapes. And what about all of those huge temples? You might be thinking of some jobs that the Greeks were, and some capital resources they would need to use, and some natural resources that they had. Check out my chart here. So the stone builders were the ones that would be building the temples, and they would use stone from nature, and they would build the temples, and they would have to use the chisels. And they also had fishermen and shipbuilders too. Go ahead and pause it if you need to add to your chart on your page. I'm going to move on to Rome. We know that Romans and Greeks lived very similarly because they lived close to each other. Farmers grew similar crops, and many men were shipbuilders and fishermen. They also had large markets where people who did other jobs sold or traded their goods. There were a lot of bakers in Rome at the marketplace. They would bake in their bakeries, and they would take it to trade or sell at the marketplace. You can pause it. I'm going to move on to Mali. Many farmers in Mali raised livestock in the grasslands. Most of the people of Mali, as we learned, relied on trading things for salt. There were huge salt mines in Mali, and people from all over Africa came to trade for salt. Remember, salt was so important. They needed it. One, they needed it for their bodies to survive, and number two, they needed it so they could preserve their meat and their food so that it would not go bad. Here's some examples of resources used in Mali. Remember, whatever one you're going to choose to write down, make sure that it matches all the way across the row. I know that was a lot of reading and writing, but I think it's important to connect what we've learned now to what we learned about in the past about these ancient civilizations. All civilizations rely on resources, especially these three resources that we've been learning about. So I want you to take one more moment, and I want to connect this to your life. What about us? So on page 17, it says, where can we find examples of what we've learned when it comes to us and where we live? Ask an adult that you live with to help you complete the following chart. Start with their job or a job of another human you know, and make that your human resource. And then ask them, what kind of tools do they use, or what kind of buildings do they work in, or what things do they make? And lastly, this is usually the hardest one, is to think about some natural resources that they have to have for their job. Now, it may not be directly using the soil, or it might not be directly using trees, but think about it. If they're using paper, that's a capital resource, but that paper comes from somewhere, okay? And that paper comes from trees, which is a natural resource. So not all jobs directly use natural resources, but somehow, some way, natural resources are needed to complete any job. So enjoy that with the adult that you are working with. And day 5 is going to be a lot of just assessing and thinking about what we learned during this unit. So come on back for day 5, and I will go over what you need to do for the last day. Great work today.